Hello and welcome to Cryptic Change. In the early days of Bitcoin, it was being hailed as an anonymous currency that quickly became popular for use in illicit activities like buying drugs on the dark web. But a lot has happened since then, and these days it's common knowledge that Bitcoin is not at all anonymous, and several governments now employ a whole range of tactics to be able to trace transactions and funds. However, while it's easy to see how anyone could trace a few coins around a single blockchain, after all, every transaction has a sending and receiving address and a hash, which means that you can follow it through the whole procedure. But things are rarely as simple as that any longer, and today it's very common to have coins being swapped, bridged, pooled and staked on all sorts of blockchains, which makes the process of tracking them all the more complicated. So in this video, I've set up a little thought experiment consisting of various cryptocurrencies being sent through 9 progressively more complicated transactions. And I've purposely left out any privacy coins as I wanted to focus on tracing funds across public blockchains and try to see just how anyone would go about doing this. So come with me as I follow the money into a blockchain wormhole that quickly gets rather complicated, but I promise I'll do my very best to make it all understandable as soon as you hit that like and subscribe button. So with that all out of the way, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the 9 hypothetical steps we're going to be going through here. First, I'm going to start off by purchasing 1 Bitcoin on Coinbase, which I pay for with my Visa. Then I'm going to transfer this 1 Bitcoin onto my personal ledger, where I will already have 2 other Bitcoins. And now I will take 1.5 Bitcoin from this ledger and change them over to Ethereum with the ledger's native swapping function. And then I go on to transfer this Ethereum onto MetaMask, where I will use a DEX to swap it over to wrapped BNB. Then I'm going to use a blockchain bridge to migrate the wrapped BNB over to the Binance Smart Chain, which means the tokens will be unwrapped over to genuine BNB and also on a different blockchain. I'll then take half the BNB and swap it over to USDT before I enter both the BNB and the UST into a liquidity pool, and then I will stake these LP tokens into a yield aggregator where they will be added to a much larger pool of funds and automatically reinvested 3 times to earn compounded interest, which I will again harvest in the form of cake tokens. And these cake tokens will then be swapped back to BNB and transferred onto Binance. And finally, I will sell the BNB over to USD and transfer that onto my old school fiat bank account via SEPA. Is that complicated enough for you? Because at the end of this, the questions then are, how many of these steps would anyone be able to trace? Just how would they do it? And would they be able to see that the USD I received at the final step of this process stems from the 1 BTC I originally purchased? So let's get to it and go all the way back to step 1, where I purchased 1 Bitcoin from Coinbase. And since I pay for this with Visa, this already gives potential trackers solid evidence of both who I am, what currency I bought, and when. Additionally, any well-known exchange like Coinbase will always require you to go through their KYC or Know Your Customer registration, and probably has established ties to various authorities, which could easily gain insight into who purchased what at any time. So at this point, there's not just one but several obvious tracks that leads this initial purchase right back to me. But then I transfer this 1 BTC onto my personal ledger wallet, where I already have 2 other BTC. So on my end, I can easily see that I have 3 BTC. But as Ledger will usually change the receiving address so as to spread the deposited funds across several addresses, will anyone else be able to see that I have 3 BTC? Or will they just see that 1 BTC from the first purchase? And now, the thing to know here is that even though these might be stored in a somewhat convoluted way, remember that if you can open up a blockchain explorer and see that it says 3 BTC, then so can everyone else. However, if you let your ledger generate a new address for this deposit, it would not be so easy to see that this 1 BTC is on the same wallet as the other 2 BTC at this point, unless they were also to trace your IP address. But more on that later. Because we're actually not done yet on this step. Because even if it's easy to trace the 1 BTC, that only accounts for where the transaction is going and not to whom. After all, instead of sending this BTC to my own ledger, I could also just have used it to buy something with, which would mean it is of course no longer in my possession. So would whoever is tracing this money also be able to see that the BTC is being sent from my account and onto another wallet which also belongs to me? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the addresses on a blockchain can be described as a chain of glass jars. And you can always see right through them and track how many transactions move inside of each jar, but you don't know who owns the jar unless someone puts a sticker on it that says it's theirs. So on a surface level, anyone tracing this transaction will have no way of knowing if this Bitcoin is still in my possession. But they can often assume that it's still mine when the only incoming transaction comes from an address which they already have identified as mine. But it gets even more interesting because let's for example say that a government agency like the IRS has been tracing these funds and they say, well, we know that you sent this BTC from Coinbase and onto this address. Then what's to stop me from just saying that, oh, I lost my account, or it was hacked, or I don't even have that ledger anymore, I lost it somewhere. I mean, what could the accusing party actually dig up as proof that the money is still owned by the same person? And here there are two things to consider. First of all, the IRS can demand that any exchange involved with them marks a Bitcoin as tainted and thus not an acceptable deposit. And if they do that, that means that as soon as you deposit this tainted crypto onto a centralized exchange, the exchange will notify the IRS, basically making the wallet useless. And even if they don't do that, they can still just track the wallet until you cash out. But the other more serious part is that someone with enough knowledge, which I assume the IRS has on their payroll, can build a node specifically to trace IP addresses of transactions, basically making every transaction associated with an IP address broadcasted onto their node. And if you were to use a VPN, it could solve this, or you could even run your own node with the right configuration. But still, in most court cases concerning crypto, the government agency will know that the criminal has the Bitcoin, only they can't always prove it, so they can't seize the funds. But back to the mission at hand, because after the BTC is on the ledger, I will take 1.5 Bitcoin and swap them over to Ethereum, which will give me somewhere around 20 ETH at the current rates. So will outsiders still be able to track and make heads or tail of this transaction, as it will draw funds from both of my BTC addresses and end up on a different blockchain?
And the answer is that while cross-chain swaps are a little bit more difficult to trace, it is far from impossible.
So if someone wanted to track this, they could easily see 1.5 BTC disappearing from a wallet and could then look up the transaction and find out if it is from a cross-chain swap. And all they would have to do then would be to check all the other swaps at around the same time to see where an equal amount entered another wallet.
And now they also have your Ethereum address, so they're still on your tail.
But we're not done yet, of course, because I will then further go on to transfer my 20 Ethereum onto MetaMask, where I will use a decentralized exchange or DEX to swap it over to approximately 180 wrapped BNB. This means that the funds will still be on the Ethereum blockchain and even have the same MetaMask address too. But it will be a different token, so can outsiders still be sure that it belongs to me?
And sadly, even though this might seem a little bit complicated, it is actually very easy to trace as it is still on the same wallet.
But also decentralized exchanges work by smart contracts, which are all easy to find with Google, and these will all have a hash code and show internal transactions. So if you were to check this on an Explorer, it will list all the transactions the smart contract performs, which means it's all still perfectly traceable. However, unless my MetaMask address has been connected to a service that required KYC or Know Your Customers, it is basically impossible for outsiders to tell if this address still belongs to me. But for the next step, we're going to use a blockchain bridge that migrate the wrapped BNB over to the Binance Smart Chain, which means that the tokens will be unwrapped over to genuine BNB and also on a different blockchain. So could prying eyes still keep a track of this?
And once again, the answer is still a resounding yes.
And the best way to describe this would be if you ever logged onto any website using your Facebook, Google, or Apple credentials, so that you only have one profile across several web pages. And adding multiple networks to your MetaMask is basically the same thing, where I still keep the same login and password, or in this case public address and private key, even if I switch chain. And also, a blockchain bridge is nothing more than two smart contracts which will lock tokens on one side and unlock them on another side. So if I were to lock 180 wrapped BNB on this side and unlock 180 BNB on the other side, it will still be the same amount at around the same time, even if I were to use a different wallet for unlocking. Meaning it's easy for outsiders to see just what I have done here. But now, I will take half of this BNB and swap it over to USDT before I enter both of them into a liquidity pool, and I will have a bunch of liquidity pool tokens consisting of 50-50 BNB and USDT. And what do you think? Is this still possible to trace?
But again, the answer is a little bit disappointing, because even though this whole process of combining two tokens into a new LP token might seem a little bit complicated,
or at least it certainly did the first time I ever tried to do this, it is actually one of the simplest transactions to trace, as it has a public hash on the blockchain. And the same goes again when I stake these LP tokens into a yield aggregator, even if they are added to a much larger pool of locked funds and automatically reinvested 3 times to earn compounded interest, which will then be harvested in the form of cake tokens, because these cake tokens will still be deposited to the same BSC address I used earlier, which would be easy to trace in a millisecond. And it gets even worse when I take these cake tokens that I earned and swap them back to BNB and transfer them onto Binance, which is of course again a well-known exchange with the KYC and established ties to authorities. But would these authorities be able to know that the receiving address belonged to Binance just from looking at the blockchain? And if they did, could they tell who owned the specific account? And the answer is, again, that while random outsiders might only be able to figure out that this address belongs to Binance, the authorities, on the other hand, would have no problem whatsoever seeing just who the funds belong to. After all, that is precisely what KYC is for in the first place. And finally, when I sell this BNB over to USD and transfer them to my old school bank account via SEPA, it would be a dead giveaway, of course. However, would anyone be able to see that the USD entering this bank account stems from the initial BTC purchased over at the Coinbase all the way back to the first step? And now the answer is kinda. Because on-chain, everything is of course traceable, but only authorities can really see the transactions between a centralized exchange and your bank. So in conclusion, there's no doubt that the more transactions you make, the more difficult it becomes to track. And this is basically what happens in real life too, when people launder money through a whole bunch of sneaky operations and shell companies. But even if an average Joe would certainly have problems following all these steps, there's still a whole range of privacy holes along the way, most notably the 2 KYC processes at the beginning and end of this long trail, which would make it only too easy for any government agency to see what's going on. But if you really wanted to stay anonymous, there are a few options to get around this. And one is simply to use more dodgy exchanges where you don't have to go through their KYC but stay within their free limits on how much you can send and receive each day. And there are a bunch of these around, especially in more liberal countries, but this will still leave a broad paper trail, so it would actually be much better to just buy Bitcoin through P2P or peer-to-peer, where you don't have to go through a KYC. Or you could also use a decentralized exchange and connect it to a secret network, or use a coin mixer built to mash around your money in such a way that it is basically untraceable, or even make swaps with privacy coins like Monero. But remember, this could still be traced if someone were to monitor the time and amounts of specific transactions. So if you want it to be as private and secret as possible, it would be best to deposit your funds to the decentralized exchange, swap your money over to a privacy coin, and then wait a day or two before you withdraw, just to make it less obvious what is going on. And privacy coins like Monero is still regarded as pretty anonymous, and there might even be some proof in their anonymity, knowing that the IRS has offered a $625,000 reward for anyone who can crack their privacy, which has never been claimed. However, know that there are multiple companies that work with exchanges and governments which track not only coins and transactions, but also all sorts of other online activity. So for example, if you open a wallet and it connects to a node, then that node might be run by a blockchain analysis company like Chainalysis. And the way your wallet performs its transaction can put a fingerprint on what kind of wallet it is, along with the date and time of your connections, as well as your IP address and location, and even what kind of device and operating system you're using. But that's not even half of it, because from your usage patterns, they can further corroborate your time zone and sleep patterns. And your computer will also be connected to other external services from which they can have access to log files. And if, for example, you have a Facebook page open while you're using a wallet, they will also know your name and basically everything there ever is to know about you. And all of this data is mined by authorities and shared globally, and it is aggregated with other data to build profiles on interesting individuals. So coupled with the actual on-chain analysis, they can find out much more about your life than you probably even remember yourself. And if all this seems way too complicated for any mere human to follow, that's also where advanced tracking tools and even artificial intelligence comes into play. Several authorities have been hiring developers for tracking projects for the last decade and will most probably have developed a whole range of complicated AI tools for this specific use by now. But then again, with how fast the whole crypto scene is constantly evolving, they would always be 2 steps behind, trying to catch up with whatever is the latest DeFi invention, as they do with white-collar criminals laundering their money very efficiently. However, as Murphy's Law states, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And if they really want to, they probably will catch up with you in the end. But that's all I have for you today, my cryptic friends. A big thanks go out to Carvel Graphics and Good Job NL on Reddit, who helped me piece all this together. And with that, the only thing remaining is to please remember to hit that like and subscribe button, and do be careful out there.